The light you see is as important to your health. We don't think much about light. Major issues like breast cancer, prostate cancer, colorectal cancer are related to really seeing the wrong light at the wrong time. Is increasing the risk of cancer in young women, just for one example. And what really matters, each of those colors has a critical effect on our health. The infrared is very critical to health and mitochondrial function and so forth.
Your book actually dives much deeper into the risks and some serious health consequences as well.
We add in this 300 lux of often blue-rich LED light and are totally disrupting our bodies and sending entirely the wrong signal.
Light can be a source of information for our bodies. Could you expand on that a little bit more? What kind of information are you referring to, and how are our bodies referring that from light?
Human body rhythms run along at close to 24.5 to 25-hour days. Without people realizing it, they drift gradually out of sync. The problem is we need to think about it because it really is a critical thing for health, and most of the lights sold today are actually rather harmful to our health.
Dr. Martin, your book, Light Doctor, is truly fascinating, and it offers a very fresh perspective on well-being. To start, for our listeners who might be encountering your work for the first time, could you briefly tell us what inspired you to write Light Doctor, and what is the core premise of Light Doctor?
Well, the core issue is that we've all focused on issues to do with nutrition and exercise, health, and quality of the air and everything else. But one of the core quotes from my book is, the light you see is as important to your health as the food you eat, the water you drink, and the air you breathe. And that's very important because we don't think much about light. Light is so readily available, whether you're outdoors or indoors, a flick of a switch, you've always got light available. But unfortunately, the quality of light we see in today's world is vastly deteriorated and is, quite frankly, inadequate to support good health. Quite the opposite, in fact. Many of the LED lights we have are contributing to an excess of disease, everything from obesity and diabetes, heart disease, psychiatric illnesses, depression, anxiety. Major issues like breast cancer, prostate cancer, colorectal cancer are related to really seeing the wrong light at the wrong time. So something we just take for granted is unfortunately something we cannot afford to take for granted. We need to actually become much more sophisticated in terms of choosing the lights we see. And that's what the book is about. The Light Doctor really explains this science, which is well developed. This is tens of thousands of scientific papers behind this, a lot of research, a lot of understanding and consensus in the scientific community, but the general public is really quite unaware that, for example, exposure to blue-rich light at night, the LED lights at night, is increasing the risk of cancer in young women, just for one example.
Wow. And when I went through this book, for me, as part of a general audience, I myself was very shocked, and I had many, eye-opening moments, especially when you talked about the quote that you just started off with, right? The light we see is as important as our health, as the air we breathe, and as the food we eat, including the water we drink. So what exactly do you mean by how the light affects us? Is it at the cellular level, or is it at the systemic level? And what kinds of light are we actually getting targeted by?
Well, light, just a basic premise in light. There is visible light and then there's invisible light. The invisible is like the ultraviolet, and also the infrared. And then there is a full spectrum, a color spectrum of lights, everything from white light that we see from the sun or from light fixtures, light bulbs, is actually made up of a mixture of colors. And what really matters, each of those colors has a critical effect on our health. Without us realizing it, there's certain color wavelengths that are help us in certain ways, act as a disinfectant. There are other color wavelengths that heal us, like from the red up at the red end of the range. Color wavelengths like green have an effect in terms of reducing pain and calmness and reduce migraine pain. And very importantly, the sort of sky blue color wavelengths in this that are combined together inside white light. You can't see them unless you've got a crystal which splits out the different colors of the rainbow, or of course you see a rainbow in the sky because the raindrops split out the white light. But though it's the composition that really matters. And in the invention of modern electric lighting, we've forgotten the importance of that. In other words, the natural outdoor daylight is full of every color of the rainbow in fairly equal quantities. But in fact, the indoor light is very artificially crafted. It's crafted to reduce energy consumption, but it doesn't do that very effectively because it's producing largely, it's aiming to produce brightness cheaply. In other words, and the visual eye, our eyes detect the green and yellow wavelengths, for example. Now, to talk about how that all happens, this is light coming in through the eyes. The eyes can detect, the photoreceptors in the eyes are sensitive to different colors. So we have rods and cones, and the cones detect different color wavelengths. But we also have these receptors in the eyes associated with non-visual effects of light. So light has visual effects. In other words, we use it in vision. That's what we think about. That's the obvious thing. But the non-visual effects are those that really influence our metabolism, our health. And one of the key ones there is a sky blue wavelengths around 480 nanometers. And those wavelengths are detected by special blue detectors in the eyes. They're called melanopsin is the photopigment that detects them. They're in particular cells in the eye called IPRGCs is the abbreviation, intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. These cells detect this blue light. And for example, during the daytime, that strengthens our circadian rhythms. It keeps our circadian clocks in alignment. And during the nighttime, it unfortunately tells us, if we see that blue light, that it's still daytime, and disrupts our health and our metabolism accordingly. So basically, it is a matter of what comes in through the eyes, what is detected in the retina, the back of the retina with special photopigments, pass through into the brain, and then it affects our metabolic and endocrine and all the systems of the body. So it's a very direct effect of light that can either help us make us healthy if we get the right composition of light, or make us very unhealthy if we don't get that composition.
Right. So in your book, you talk about the risks, and many people associate artificial light with only sleep disruption, right? We see that everywhere now on social media and just general news. But your book actually dives much deeper into the risks and some serious health consequences as well because of that exposure to the wrong types of light. And you briefly gave us an introduction to the different colors of light. But in our modern lifestyle, Dr. Martin, you also in the book describe how we are living a lifestyle where we're depriving of certain beneficial light exposures. So what are some practical examples of how this life deficit manifests in our lives, and what are some things that we could incorporate in our lives to live a better lifestyle?
Well, for most of human history, people lived much more outdoors than they do today. So, and as a result, they get exposed to this very much brighter and much fuller spectrum light, all the colors of the rainbow and the spectrum and ultraviolet and infrared. And when we moved indoors, we sort of start protecting ourselves, we think. Unfortunately, we're getting it wrong some of the times from ultraviolet. We tend to block out the window glass, blocks out ultraviolet. It also blocks out the infrared. We're now realizing the infrared is very critical to health and mitochondrial function and so forth. But Yeah, and also we're moving into very dim indoor light. In other words, just to give you a sense of it, a cloudy day, one measure of the brightness of light is something called lux. So on a cloudy day, you might have 10,000 lux outside. On a bright sunny day, it might be up to 50,000 or 100,000 lux. Indoors, we're running around with about 300 lux typically. Very, very low levels. So we're living indoors in sort of what we might call twilight levels of light. So we're light deprived. And so that's one of the reasons why getting outside, particularly in the mornings, is so critical to our health. In other words, getting a good dose of natural sunlight or daylight. It doesn't matter if it's a cloudy day because there's still a lot of natural light out there. So that's one part of it. And then, of course, in natural nighttime, when people used to sleep in the dark at night, candles are pretty expensive, and they didn't produce much light, and people tend to sleep in the dark. Then, in fact, that level of light is extremely low. Moonlight is maybe a third of a lux at best, and a cloudy night, it's far darker. So now what we do is we add in this 300 lux of often blue-rich LED light and are totally disrupting our bodies and sending entirely the wrong signal. So this matters to health, Dolica, because we now know in very large studies involving tens of thousands of people that those people who get outside more than others, who spend more time outdoors, will actually live longer. They have less cardiac disease, less heart disease, less cancers, less other diabetes and so forth as a result of being outside and they also live longer if you get outside, years longer. And similarly, people who sleep with the lights on at night, a remarkable number of people do, 40% more of the general population, 50% plus of the more elderly population sleeps with some lights on in the bedroom. They also have higher rates, shorter lifespans if you have the lights on at night. In other words, if you want to have a long and healthy life, get outside, exposed to daylight during the daytime as much as you can, and sleep in the dark at night. And yet we've gone way away from that in our modern society where the lights are always on out of convenience. And, some people have lights on in the bedroom because of anxiety or boredom or whatever else, but it has big effects on health. So that's part of what we're learning. We're learning that, you really have to, and the question is, how do we live a life, when it's dark, and particularly in winters and the evenings are long, you don't want to be sitting around in the dark. Well, some of our research showed that we can actually solve that problem by creating light that's as normally bright as you would want to use for reading and working and doing whatever tasks you have. But if you remove the blue content out of it, then we've actually taken away the signal, this key signal that is telling the brain whether it's night or day. And so you can have lights that are zero blue content, and that, in fact, solves the problem. Another way of doing it is using blue blocking glasses, providing they're blocking this correct blue. So by doing some of these things, we're seeing quite dramatic effects in terms of health and performance and well-being. And so really, we need to stop and think about the fact that most of the lights today are extremely unhealthy we're using. And we need to go out and start really thinking about lights that are going to make you healthy. And that's what the Light Doctor is about, is helping people out how to find those lights, understand why, understand the consequences, and be able to convince others that we need to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. So you just mentioned blue light blocking glasses. So in addition to blue light blocking glasses, what other kinds of light bulbs or, just different kinds of additions that our audience can incorporate into their life to emit, and to reduce even the exposure of these negative light exposures?
Right. Well, what you need to do is have lights once it's after sunset, light bulbs or light fixtures that are essentially blue-free, and that means really less than 2% content is the blue. There are various vendors that have these today.
Oh, really?
There's some new ones coming out from a company called Chorus, Korrus, which has lights that actually automatically change from containing blue during the day, and then automatically the light bulbs switch to being blue free at night.
Wow.
And so, that's one. But and I have a website called circadianlight.org, which can point people to where to find the sort of, different types of lights and what their properties are. But there are a number of vendors. But the challenge is they're a bit more expensive because they are produced in smaller quantities than the mass production bulbs. But the health effects difference is so enormous that it's really,
Right.
it's something that everyone needs to think about.
Right. And I always like to believe that even if it's a couple dollars more to get something more healthier today is much better than paying hundreds and thousands of dollars in hospital bills and to recover. So
Yeah.
it might be hard now, but at least if we're able to reduce our expenses in certain areas that are maybe not a priority and kind of make up that amount to put into our health, to the betterment of our health, that would be amazing. I want to touch a little bit on the circadian clock that you mentioned. So, there's a lot of misconceptions, right? We talked about how we have to be more outdoors, but the notion today, Dr. Martin, is that we are going outdoors or trying to be more outdoors for the sake of getting more sun, more vitamin D. But you talk much more than that, right? You talk about the impacts at the cellular level. So, what exactly is the human circadian clock?
Well, this is our bodies are rhythmic, are naturally rhythmic in keeping with the natural day-night cycle, and we've internalized that, and animals over the whole animal kingdom has internalized that. Really, it's a survival advantage. If you know in advance when it's going to become dawn, your body can be ready. You can be ready to go out, hunt and gather and whatever. And during the evening, you want to get somewhere safe. You want some forewarning of that. So we've internalized that in a clock in our master clock in the brain, but actually millions of clocks in every cell of our body. The master clock in the brain, we discovered it when I was leading the team at Harvard Medical School, called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, is a small cluster of cells. It's got a direct connection back from the eyes, from these blue detectors in the eyes, that feed directly into this SCN, or suprachiasmatic nucleus, this clock. And that clock governs the rhythms of the body. In other words, it governs when cortisol levels rise in the morning, when melatonin levels rise in the middle of the night, when growth hormone arises in the beginning of sleep. All these different rhythms are going on as we got thousands and thousands of things in the body are changing naturally with the time of day. So that whole rhythmic system of our body gets disrupted when you see the wrong light at the wrong time. In other words, you get into this state of chronic jet lag effectively. In other words, jet lag is when your biological clocks are out of sync with the world you're living in. Just like if you fly to Paris and are now, in a different time zone, it would take some days where you don't feel really at your best before your clocks get adjusted. So our circadian clocks are synchronized to the environment. They do gradually adjust to our environment. But what we've understood is what matters is not only the synchrony between our master clock and the outside world is important, but also all the internal systems of the body. Because when we get into a state of what's called circadian disruption, when we get all those clocks out of alignment with each other, it's a bit like a discordant orchestra with everything off key and not working together. And that is what's associated with the increased risk of diabetes and obesity and heart disease and cancers and so forth. And so the body is a very finely tuned machine. And when that gets out of whack, it creates real problems for people's health.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the book, you touch upon the idea that light can be a source of information for our bodies. Could you expand on that a little bit more? What kind of information are you referring to, and how are our bodies referring that from light?
Well, there's interaction between light falling on our eyes and the resetting of our clock. So light in the morning advances the clock, and light in the evening delays the clock. Light in the middle of the day doesn't do much, but that's a constant adjustment. It's sort of like a little nudging of your clock. Our clock tends to drift, by the way. Our natural clocks tend to drift a little longer than 24 hours. We knew that early on by putting people in environments where there are no time cues, no windows, nothing to tell the time of day. And we'd see the human body rhythms run along at close to 24 and a half to 25-hour days. Without people realizing it, they drift gradually out of sync in the absence of strong light cues. That is corrected every day in the normal life by exposure to light. That's why light in the morning is very helpful to keep that, prevent that drifting of the clock to later hours. And then a lot of sleep disorders, of course, associated with people getting out of sync, with seeing the wrong light at the wrong time, exposed to a lot of blue-rich LED light in the evening. It tends to shift your body clock to later hours, and it makes you out of step with local time and puts your whole metabolism out of step. So the body, there's a lot of timing information in the light we see, and the body is normally naturally doing this very well. So one of the other things that's critical to good health is maintaining a stable pattern, a stable bedtime, stable waking up time. The people who get in the most trouble are those who stay up really late during the week, but then have to get up to go to work, for example, and get a bit sleep deprived because they've shortened their sleep, and then they catch it up at the weekend by sleeping in extended hours. So it's basically a problem where people are getting out of sync, and that's associated with chronic ill health. We know it's very difficult. One quite instructive thing is studies about people living across time zones. As you know, our world today is divided into time zones. So you're in Dallas, we're in Boston here. But what matters is the time zone is actually something, it's an average thing, of course, but essentially the sun rises an hour, at least an hour earlier in the most eastern part of your time zone than in the west part of your time zone. So here in Boston, we're near the east side. The sun is rising in Detroit, which is still on Eastern time, about an hour later than it is here. And it so happens that those people who live at the west side of the time zone, in other words, who get the sun latest, actually have more ill health than those that live on the east. So you can look at the time zone map across the country and look at counties up and down the line from those on the west side of the time zone and those on the east side of the time zone across the time zone divide. And you'll find the people on that who get the sun earliest on the in the new time zone are much healthier than those who are trying to live on a time zone that's an hour offset. So we're very sensitive to small changes in the timing of the light we see. It's also true that, that when we do daylight savings time and we change in the spring and people move an hour, traffic accidents increase, heart attacks increase, just that minor stress of changing by even an hour the timing of exposure to light. So we are actually very sensitive to the light schedule we see, much more than we actually realize. As I say, we just take light for granted. Lights are on, switch on the wall, don't think about it. But, the problem is we need to think about it because it really is a critical thing for health. And most of the lights sold today are actually rather harmful to our health.
Wow, that's very eye-opening, Dr. Martin. So, you in the example that you mentioned, right, we are all around in different parts of the country, the world, and some of those factors we can't control, like especially when you work in an office or those that work in schools, hospitals, and even live in places where the sun is coming up late. So in situations where, there is no control in the individual's hands, what are some things that we can do to really just advocate for a healthier living?
Well, first of all, I think some of the freedom where people have people working at home more actually have more ability to, choose the schedule that makes sense for them. And so I think that's given us a bit more freedom than the days when everyone just commuted to work, to the office, and was everyone forced to go up at the same time. Now, the problem is school timing is one of the issues. So that the children, particularly teenage children, do much better if you don't give them a very early start. And yet what we do with our high school students is we force them to get up very early to get on buses to go to school.
Right.
And we're really forcing them to be way outside. And what's interesting is some of the schools in Boston have recognized this. High school students actually get to school later or have to get up later than they used to, which is better for their health. But in Detroit, they haven't recognized this. So they get, even as already mentioned, an hour difference in the time the sun rises, but there's an hour difference in addition to the time they have to get up in Detroit. And so we're doing devastating things to the children of Detroit as compared to the children of Boston. Partly it's naturally geography, but partly it's also the policy of when we run our schools. So we need to be much more aware of this in terms of thinking about it. But some of the best way is, time zones are really something that's we should not be just governed by, and we should be adjusting our lifestyles around what makes health and what relates to the natural sunrise, sunset schedules of our local environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I was in school, especially in high school, I used to wake up at 5:30 because my bus used to be here at outside of my house at 6:30. So, like you mentioned in the earlier example, obviously we would be sleep deprived because as a high schooler, there used to be activities after school, right? And by the time I got home and did my homeworks and everything else to catch up to do essential things for school, it would be late. And so then there's this constant cycle of catching up on sleep. So if I'm understanding you correctly, Dr. Warner, you're saying that sleep is essential, 8 hours, 9 hours, whatever that count number is. Do you think there is a universal number for everyone, or do you think it's just based on body? Because, in social media, we see that some people are okay with 5 hours of sleep. What do you think about that?
First of all, there is some difference in sleep need. So some people can cope with shorter amounts of sleep than others. It's also age related. So certainly young adults or teenagers do require more sleep, and young children require a lot more sleep. But the average adult, the evidence suggests the healthy amount of sleep is about 7 hours in reality, associated with longevity and other measures in large populations. But bearing in mind that that in fact there are some differences. Some people do genuinely need 8 or 9 hours of sleep. And that's a matter of finding out what you need to maintain yourself and keep alert during the day. Now, there are also people who are, boast about how little sleep they need. That's really a question, I think often that they're pushing beyond the limits, and that's not good for their health. In other words, it doesn't give you maybe a macho or a tech bro thing to be operating on very little sleep.
Right.
But not always smart. And, I think we see, Elon Musk popping ketamine and God knows what else to try to compensate for his patents. It'd be far better to be on a healthier schedule, right?
Right.
And probably he'd be more productive on a healthier schedule than, trying to use pharmaceuticals to modify his state of alertness and cognitive ability.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of that was my motive to ask that question, which is, we see these big leaders on social media saying that they're okay with a certain number of sleep, and teenagers and young adults kind of get influenced by that, and they think it's okay to not have 8 hours, 7, 8 hours of sleep. And that really affects our mental stability as well. Like, I know if I don't sleep a good 7 to 8 hours every night, the next day I am going to be a bit groggy. I am probably even going to get a bit of a headache and not have good focus and just a lot of just brain instability. And I want to talk to you about the metaphorical or even spiritual aspects of light. So, how do you think that light has an impact on our spiritual health?
Well, as I say, that's the biggest metaphor in the Bible, isn't it? Talking about and other religious writings, talking about light, and so there's a lot talked about the role of light, and that's because light and dark in the ancient world was such a dominating thing to our life. In other words, in the absence of electricity, we've only had that for 150 years at most.
Yeah.
So in the absence of electricity, the world and long before that, the world was very much governed by light and dark, and
Right.
and so we've got all sorts of spiritual things about light. I think the issue of being in harmony with nature is absolutely critical. I mean, this is really what we're talking about, is getting back into being in a harmonious state with nature. I think some of the interesting things are studies where they've taken people out of the modern world and put them back in nature. It's a fascinating study by Professor Kenneth Wright at the University of Colorado Boulder, who took groups of people out into the wilderness in the Rocky Mountains, far away from any electric lights. They were not allowed to bring any electric devices with them, no iPhones, of course, nothing like that, no flashlights, nothing, no artificial source of light. And then to live for a week or more in that environment, they slept in tents and they'd have campfires and so forth, but they'd live like our ancestors did. And what was seen in that environment is people felt so much better, healthier. They slept longer. They were more alert, and really were operating at their best selves as a result of getting back into the natural cycle. Now, what's also interesting there is, by the way, that some of the exposure to light, it matters very differently in people. There are people who are morning types and people who are evening types. And so when we have people who are morning types and evening types, then what we have a big difference in terms of how they respond. So the people who are evening types are people who naturally who naturally stayed up late and tended to sleep in the mornings. And people, the morning types, are those who tend to get up early but go to bed early. Well, would you believe that all those morning and evening types essentially became the same people when they're out in the natural world? So it tells you there's a difference between the way that people interact with light and dark. And so so what we're seeing is the people, the evening types, are actually more sensitive to blue rich light. Their circadian clocks are shifted more, and they get more sleep problems and more health problems. And so there are differences in our individual sensitivity to that light, and particularly in the evening hours, that make a big difference. But yeah, going back in the natural world is really associated with we need to be able to get in back in sync with those natural rhythms.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that we're seeing more awareness about this topic, but from a standpoint of resetting our circadian rhythm, resetting our circadian clock. But you just take it a step further, which is just amazing and fascinating for me. So now, as we wrap up this conversation, Dr. Martin, for someone who's intrigued by the concept of light doctor, but feels overwhelmed by where to start, what would be maybe a few immediate actionable steps that they could take today to begin incorporating more benefits and just become more healthier beyond getting more sun?
Well, I think you need to adopt a healthy light diet. I mean, my book, The Light Doctor, I see you've got it there on your screen, right?
Yes.
Okay. Goes through this, but basically some of the fundamental elements are, and this is something that immediately converts into better health, feeling better, and so forth, is
Right.
make sure you sleep in the dark at night. In other words, make sure the bedroom is free of extraneous lights. If you are going to have some alarm clock or something in the building, in the room, make sure it has a red dial instead of a blue or a white dial. In other words, it doesn't contain any of this blue light. If you do have lights to find your way to the bathroom, make sure they're down at sort of floor level and are yellow, orange, or red in color, so that basically you're avoiding this blue light at night, which is so devastating. That's number one. So sleep in the dark at night and sleep on the regular schedule. Secondly, in the mornings, get out in the daylight and the sunlight every day if you can. And, ideally aim for half an hour or more if you can do that. And what that has a big effect in terms of synchronizing your clock. It actually does all sorts of things in people, older people, as their eye vision fades. The infrared in that, or the red light in daylight, actually rejuvenates the eyes. The blue light synchronizes your clock. The green light is actually calms you down, produces a state of calmness. All those things are, in the natural light spectrum. So get the natural light you can. During the day, if you can be near windows, it makes a difference. Those people who have offices near windows, with windowed offices, sleep half an hour more longer at night on average than people who don't, who are back in the cubicles, not exposed to natural light. And then during the evening hours, make sure for at least the 3 hours before bedtime that you're using lights that are blue-free, that are zero blue-free lights that avoid that problem. And then, as I say, sleeping in the dark at night. So that getting onto that cycle and making a regular cycle has just enormous effects in terms of people's health and well-being.
Absolutely. Totally agree with you. And I'm going to look more into the kinds of bulbs to change. And I think you talked about the website, the Circadian Doctor, is it?
Yeah, circadianlight.org is a website that will tell you what's going on about some of the products and so forth. The lightdoctor.com is the website for the book. But essentially, yes, it's a new area. And I also have a Substack column where every 2 weeks I'm writing about the subject and what the new breakthroughs are, what the new science is, and also some of the practical regulatory problems we're facing with the LED light bulbs. That we've got the incandescent light bulbs have been banned because of energy considerations, false energy considerations, I might say. We also have, and we got various healthy light bulbs becoming available that are threatened by new regulations. So all that, what's going on in that world, what's going on in terms of new lighting products and new glasses, eyewear, and so forth. There's a lot of great work going on in this space, and it's very important. And I think people are just beginning to wake up. We need to talk more about it, have people fully aware. And that's why I wrote the book, The Light Doctor. And that's why I'm so delighted to be on your podcast and help spread the word to your audience.
Yeah,
and
no,
beyond.
thank you so much. Dr. Martin, the pleasure is all mine. And I'm very grateful. And I feel very fortunate that, I have this opportunity to speak with you, because there's so much happening in this space that is not coming, and there's no awareness, right? Like as a general audience in the world, I never knew there was so much impact that light has in our bodies and on our health at the circular level until I came across you. And so I think we're all grateful for that. And if there's one takeaway that every single, reader should learn from, what is that one thing? Because if anyone in the audience has not read this book yet, what do you think would really help them, open their eyes?
Well, I think it really questions, don't take light for granted. The light you see is so critical for your health, and it's the composition of that light, what that light is made up of. And so being aware of that and learning how to choose lights that are healthy and avoid lights that are unhealthy is really critical for all of us. It's not easy because what you buy in the stores has no health markings to it. And so it's just rather like, what is being sold by the lighting industry right now is largely junk light. And junk light is as harmful to us as junk food, ultra-processed food. It's the same problem. You can't tell so easily, although people are becoming more aware of it. But they really need to be aware of this problem of junk light, and that healthy light makes all the difference to your health and well-being and how long you're going to live.
Absolutely. So last question for you, Dr. Martin. what's next for you in terms of your research or advocacy around the power of light?
Well, one of the things I'm focusing on right now is how to make sure we create a protected class for healthy light bulbs. So all this research and these light bulbs are protected and can go forward and aren't impacted by some of these Department of Energy regulations, which have started to threaten the use of healthy light. That's the worst thing we can do to ourselves, force everybody to be blue rich junk light as the only thing available. So I'm really advocating also the various companies and entrepreneurs that are bringing solutions now, becoming more and more available. So I'm very excited about we're now learning and what we're doing. But the biggest hurdle is getting the general public to be aware of this. Scientists, by the way, are totally in consensus about this. I mean, I've led a scientific consensus of 250 of the world's leading scientists, published the most papers in this space, and we could all agree on what the fundamentals were, that all lights should be circadian. In other words, all lights should vary their color content, their wavelength content with the time of day. And if we just use static lights that never change, that's the worst thing we can do for our health.
Absolutely. And just like, any other product, the more consumers, refrain from buying that, the more companies will start to create better products. And I think it same applies to what we just spoke about as well. The more we stop buying these ultra processed lights, or like you said, junk light, then maybe the companies will start to create more healthier light.
Yeah, that's right. There's a pattern there. You've got to have demand as well as supply. And that's part of what I'm trying to do, is encourage the supply and also encourage the demand so this thing can take off.
Right. And this goes much beyond humans, right? You also talk about in the book, and I'll leave it for the audience to read, but you talk about the consequences for wildlife, biodiversity, and just, pollution and several other areas. So
huge consequences.
Huge consequences. But Dr. Warren, thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom. It was an incredible conversation, and I'm very confident that our audience is going to learn so much from this. So really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Dolica. It's been a pleasure.